Hi, I'm Debra Kaplan, professor of Jewish history in the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at bar-Ilan University. And today I'd like to talk briefly with you about a really interesting and relevant topic, crossing borders in early modern Germany. While the phrase early modern Germany may not seem relevant to all of us, certainly crossing borders is. And we've all had the experience of having to cross borders, whether by land or sea or by air, and having to present documentation to identify who we are and to be able to cross the borders. The question really is, how did people cross borders in earlier times? The early modern period in Europe from about 1450 to 1800 is a wonderful example of a period we can look back to in order to think about how people crossed borders in the past. And one of the reasons that this is a particularly interesting time period is because it was a time of heightened mobility, where people traveled from one country to the next, or from one principality to the next. An additional reason why this is so very interesting is because this was a time of increased documentation and bureaucracy, when all of a sudden, all different kinds of records were kept, maintained, and presented. And so this was really the time where we see the birth of the early modern passport, which was called in those days the safe conduct. In order to illustrate, I'd like to begin with a story from a rabbinic responsum. The responsum is from a rabbi named Yair Chaim Bachrach, who was one of the most important rabbis in Germany at the end of the 17th century, serving at the end of his life in the community of Worms. And in order to do that, I will read an English translation from his responsum, at the same time presenting a map of the places he's going to mention. You see here the title page of his book of responsa, Chavot Yair. The responsum begins. It once happened that Reuven and Shimon, and these are pseudonyms for men, traveled from Frankfurt am Main, you can see Frankfurt here, the start of the journey, to Worms, and that was the hometown of Bachrach. In Frankfurt, there was a woman whose husband was in Worms, and her single daughter was with her. They also wished to travel to Worms. Since they did not have a safe conduct, that's the passport, as was necessary for travel in the electoral palatinate, which is the region that you see before you in the map that we'll talk about briefly, they asked the aforementioned Reuven and Shimon that Reuven should say, "This is my wife," and Shimon should say, "This is my daughter." So in other words, the two women were going to pretend to be the respective wife and daughter of these two men, and therefore travel together with them on the safe conducts, because early modern safe conducts allowed for a head of household to travel along with members of his family. They arrived at Oppenheim, and you can see here the checkpoint, the place in which one presented the safe conduct. Those who traveled without the safe conduct would be fined a sum of 10 gulden or any other sum as determined by the collector. When they arrived, the aforementioned Reuven and Shimon said, as mentioned above, that the women were respectively their wife and daughter, because the safe conduct was inscribed with the name of the mail holder and permitted him to travel free of tax along with his wife and family members. The collector was foolish and familiar with Jewish customs. He said, "I do not believe you. This elderly woman is the wife of Reuven, who is young in years. And how can Shimon have a daughter that is so old? Rather, let each man swear that his words are true, or else kiss the women full on the mouth. Reuven should kiss his wife and Shimon his daughter." Now, as a sort of interjection, neither Jewish man wanted to do this because this was against all kinds of Jewish legal rulings on menstrual purity, because in fact, these women were imposters. They were not actually the wife and daughter of Reuven and Shimon. Reuven and Shimon said that the woman posing as Reuven's wife was menstrually impure, and that the maiden had similarly not immersed at the time of her menstrual period. Even if she would have immersed, it was considered disgraceful and sinful for a Jew to kiss his own grown daughter. The guard said, "Swear that they are menstrually impure," for he had forgotten he had asked them to take an oath on the main context of their claim that they were relatives, and instead fixated on the less important elements, the demand to kiss the women and the reluctance to do so because they were impure. The older woman said to Reuven that it was true. She was menstrually impure, and he could take an oath to that effect. Reuven, however, was hesitant to take an oath based on her words, and he responded that he did not have direct knowledge. It was only based on her words. Rather, she and the virgin should take the oath. When they approached to take the oath, the guard remembered his initial demand and instructed that along with their other oath, they also swear that this woman is Reuven's wife, and this other woman is Shimon's daughter. Or they could kiss the women, or else they would have to face consequences. This story was told to me by one of the travelers, me, of course, is Bachrach, and in the end, the travelers came to an agreement with the guard at a small cost. So this is a very dramatic story in which we see many really interesting things. We see a system of traveling with a passport. We see already a ruse for when you don't have a passport, trying to purport to be someone else in order to cross the border. And we see a guard who's familiar enough with Jewish customs to try to test out the women's identity. I'd like to use this really fascinating story as a springboard for a brief foray into the world of safe conduct in this area, the area of the electoral palatinate that was mentioned in the rabbinic responsum. Now we have here a map of the region from 1711, just about a decade after Bachrach's responsum would have been printed in Frankfurt. And you can see here, just looking at the colors, the very many regions which cover the electoral palatinate. And just as a more modern map, which may be more visible on this video, you can see here through the different colors how this was a very fractured landscape. Like much of the Holy Roman Empire, which is today Germany, there were many different principalities, cities, ecclesiastical lands, and also other principalities that bordered one another. And so traveling from one place to another required crossing many boundaries. The system for handling this that was devised in the empire was that one political leader, the elector of the electoral palatinate, was in charge of all of the different border crossings from Mainz in the north, stretching down to Alsace in the south. And as you saw on the previous map, this was an area that was filled with different border crossings. So you might cross in and out of various different lands just on one short journey. Now, both Christian and Jewish travelers needed to be able to present documentation in order to cross these borders. And at some checkpoints, they needed to pay a tax on some of the merchandise if they were traveling as merchants, as Jews often were. And what I'd like to talk about briefly today is the special safe conduct that was given out to Jews who wished to travel in this area. The safe conduct is a concept of a document that provided safe passage to the person who carried it. And it was a document that was really born in the Middle Ages, primarily for representatives of kings who would try to cross borders and would use these documents as part of the release of hostage-taking and other kinds of diplomatic negotiations. And the safe conduct in the early modern period really evolved from that. And as such, it's a really interesting document. In the case of the Jewish community, one very formal document with the seal of the emperor or of the elector, depending on what kind of pass you had for each specific area, was granted to the community as a whole. And here, from the archives in Jerusalem, you can see an example of a safe conduct that was granted by the elector of the Palatinate to the Jews who wished to travel in his regions. And you can note the beautiful wax seal that accompanied this document. Obviously, this was not a document that every Jew could present, as was in the case of the responsum that we read. Reuven and Shimon did not each have this unique document to carry with them. Rather, one Jewish community, the Jewish community of Worms, was the community that received this document in exchange for a payment. And this is one of the big differences between the Jewish safe conduct and the safe conduct issued to other travelers. While a regular merchant might acquire a safe conduct from the relevant authority, the Jewish community was required as a whole to pay a flat tax, an expensive flat tax, in exchange for which they would receive this document. Then the Jewish community was able to issue little documents for each traveler to carry with him or her on the road. And those would be purchased either by individual Jewish communities from the major Jewish community, which had been issued this safe conduct document, or by individual travelers, depending on the case. But the main issue is to understand the difference between the Jewish safe conduct and the Christian safe conduct was that only Christians who wished to travel and cross borders were required to acquire this safe conduct, whereas the entire Jewish community as a whole had to pay a flat tax and then figure out a way to subsidize that tax by passing on the cost to individual communities or individual travels. So first, let's take a brief look at how this document looked. This is what we call a Taschengeleit, a pocket safe conduct. Taschen means pocket, and Geleit is safe conduct in German. And that's the German name for these documents. We have a few in the archive, which is an unbelievable thing because these are very ephemeral documents that are meant to be thrown out because they are documents that expire, sort of like our own passports. And these documents would have been valid for a period of about a year. And you can see that they are printed with the name of the Jew who purchased the document written inside, and here his signature on the back in Hebrew/Yiddish. And these were the documents that were purchased. Now, as I mentioned, in the case of the electoral palatinate, the elector of the electoral palatinate gave the large safe conduct with a seal to the Jewish community of Worms. And here you see a map of Worms from the time of Bachrach, from the time that we're discussing. The Jews lived here in a curved street in the Judengasse, a ghetto that was locked at night, but open during the day. And in the community of Worms, there were about 700 Jews living in the community. And the tax that the elector imposed on the Jewish community was quite high, reaching to thousands of gulden, a sum that the community could not possibly pay on its own. Moreover, and this is extremely important, it was not the case that only the Jews from Worms needed to travel in that area. As you saw in the earlier map, any Jews from Mainz to Alsace, or even from elsewhere, who wished to travel from one place to another, were required to present this particular small Taschengeleit, which they could only acquire from the Jewish community in Worms. And so we see a description of how this works in some of the communal documentation of the time period. And I should just mention that this is really exciting research because even though we have references to these documents and actual copies of these documents in the archive, the question of everyday travel is not one that has really been looked at. And so by looking at this, we're not only understanding how Jews traveled and the mechanics of that, but we're also getting a really important glimpse into communal dynamics and intercommunal dynamics. We're learning about an entire system that connected different Jewish communities across space, both financially and sort of logistically, and we can learn a lot about how different communities related to one another. So just to bring a couple of examples of the documentation through which we learn about this system of travel. First, we have the custom books of the sexton, the shamash of the Jewish community, Yuspa Shamash, who discusses this document, the Geleit, only he refers to it by its Hebrew name, the Tiur, which actually also means escort. So it's a Hebrew translation of the German document, for the German word for the safe conduct. And he explains that the safe conduct was purchased, or I should say that flat tax was subsidized by many Jews in different places. Those that reside here, and those who are in the surrounding region, even those communities and settlements which are not under the jurisdiction of our community, such as Frankfurt am Main, which we saw, of course, in the responsum from Bachrach, Mainz, Bingen, and the like. All of them must pay their share of the Geleitbriefe. So all of these different communities contributed a piece to defray that cost that the Jews of Worms had to pay in order to procure that main safe conduct. One of the most amazing documents that I have come across in the various archives and libraries in which I have worked is actually what we call a Pinkas Tiurim. A Pinkas, a communal logbook of different safe conducts. And this is of actually a Gabbai, an administrator of the safe conducts that I've discussed here. And he kept a logbook, which is actually kept today in the National Library in Israel, in Jerusalem, of all the different communities and all the different individuals who purchased these safe conducts that you have seen, these small Taschengeleite, for the period of the year 1686. Now, what I've done is to take the contents of this logbook, the contents of these Pinkas, and to map them out in order to understand the dynamics. Where are different Jews traveling? Where do different Jews live? And how do they connect with one another? And I'd like to share those maps with you. Here's an example of the first map from which Jews purchased the Tiurim, the Geleitbriefe, these safe conducts, in the year 1685 to 1686. And you can see here, every red dot is a community from which the Jews purchased safe conduct. So we see Jews coming from as far as Prague, all the way into the region, high concentration in this rectangle, which I'll get to momentarily, of Jews who are living right in and around that region. Jews from as far west as Metz, as far north as some of these northern areas of Germany, as far south as the Swiss Confederation, all traveling to this region. So this one document gives us a tiny peek, 1 year of history, but the range of places in which Jews resided, because sometimes we don't even know that Jews lived in some of these small, tiny towns and villages, aside from the fact that Jews were mentioned in this Pinkas as having come from these towns and villages and then having purchased a safe conduct in order to travel to the area of the electoral Palatinate. We also see the range of travel, how many different kinds of Jews were in contact with one another, whether once or several times a year, and presenting these safe conducts. I would just say in parentheses here that even this picture is only partial, and that's something that we see very clearly in the responsum with which I started this brief lecture. Because if those women, the ones who purported to be the wives of Reuven and Shimon, were traveling without a safe conduct, we can assume they were not the only ones who were trying to put up a false identity in order to cross borders when they had no documents. And therefore, this is a picture of those travelers who actually did purchase the requisite documentation. Just like to show you one more map, a zoom in of this area here in the rectangle, the area in and around the electoral Palatinate. And you can see how many different towns and villages Jews resided and from how many different places they traveled. You see here, Worms, the city in which from which they procured those safe conducts. So I'd like to speak a little bit about how this worked economically. Economically, sometimes certain cities imposed a tax on their residents and their merchants, and then used that money and transferred it to Worms in order to procure safe conduct for their own residents. In other cases, we see individual Jews procuring safe conducts from Worms, especially at the yearly Frankfurt Fair, which was an opportunity to travel, do business, procure books, procure all kinds of ritual items such as etchugim, and also procure and pay for these safe conducts. One other element that I'd like to mention is the fact that sometimes Jews in these small communities did not have enough money to pay their share of the safe conduct tax. And so what we see as evidenced in this letter, also from the archives in Jerusalem, is that sometimes a wealthy Jew might pay money as an advance on behalf of others or on behalf of a Jewish community and lend them money, thereby still allowing them to travel and yet defraying that cost for the Worms community, which was unable to independently pay for this tax as the rate of the tax got higher and higher. And this is a system that lasted for hundreds of years. And you can imagine this letter is from the period of the 9 Years' War, one of the big wars that raged through the electoral Palatinate, especially during times of war. It was very, very hard for Jewish communities to pay their share of the tax. And so what we see through this letter and through all of this documentation is a development of a very robust intercommunal system, both financial and logistical, administrative, in which Jews from different places worked together with the Jews of Worms in order to purchase the necessary documents that they needed in order to travel on a daily basis. And it also gives us a real glimpse into the various dynamics that individual Jews would have needed in order to travel and cross borders, which in early modern Germany was something they did so very frequently for so many basic needs. Anyone who's more interested in this topic is welcome to have a look at this article that I wrote in Jewish Quarterly Review, where I spoke about this more at length and provided many more details about the safe conducts. But I hope that you enjoyed learning a bit about how early modern Jews traveled and how Jewish communities worked together in order to facilitate that travel with the governmental bureaucracies of the time.